His stepmother forced her stepdaughter to become engaged to a beggar to humiliate her. On the day of the wedding, everyone was shocked by the secret the beggar revealed. The scorching sun of Chicago beat down on Michigan Avenue, where Luke, a 28-year-old man with disheveled hair and worn-out clothes, sat on the sidewalk. His once bright hazel eyes were now dull from exhaustion and hunger. His prominent ribs, visible beneath his torn shirt, told the story of weeks without enough food. Luke watched the frantic rush of people around him, feeling invisible. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten in over 2 days. "Just one more day, Luke. Someone will notice you today," he muttered, trying to hold on to hope. Who am I kidding? No one looks at a beggar twice, he thought bitterly. Hours dragged on, and Luke fought the temptation to scavenge through nearby trash cans. He had promised himself he wouldn't go that low. Yet hunger was an unforgiving enemy. His eyes followed people passing by with bags of food or cups of coffee. The smell of a nearby hot dog stand tormented him, making his mouth water and his stomach ache. Maybe I should try the shelter again, he considered, but shook his head. No, I can't. Not after the last time. He shuddered, avoiding the memory. As the day wore on, Luke's despair grew. Other homeless people asked for spare change, but he couldn't muster the courage. His pride, the last thing he had, held him back. An older man nearby, watching Luke, spoke up. "Kid, sometimes it feels hopeless, but we survive." The man's voice was rough with age and hardship. Luke sighed. "I know, but it feels like we'll never escape this. We survive on the few coins kind people give, but we need jobs, homes, healthy food." Suddenly, as if fate had heard his silent plea, a middle-aged woman stopped in front of him. Without a word, she handed him a warm sandwich wrapped in a paper bag. The smell of fresh bread and roasted meat overwhelmed Luke's senses. His eyes filled with gratitude as he looked up at her. "Thank you, ma'am. You have no idea how much this means to me," he choked out. The woman smiled kindly and walked away, leaving Luke in awe. Maybe there's still kindness in the world, he thought, a flicker of hope lighting up inside him. As Luke prepared to enjoy the sandwich, he noticed 2 other homeless men nearby, their thin faces reflecting his own struggles. Without hesitation, he split the sandwich into 3 parts and offered them pieces. "Hey guys, let's share. No one should go hungry if we can help each other," he said hoarsely but kindly. Across the street, 2 women were watching the scene unfold. Grace, a young woman with long blonde hair and compassionate brown eyes, felt her heart ache at the sight of Luke's generosity. She took a step toward him, but was stopped by her stepmother, Helena, a stern-looking woman with icy blue eyes and sharp features. "Don't you dare, Grace! I won't allow you to mix with those people," Helena hissed, tightening her grip on Grace's arm. "But Helena, they need help. How can we just walk by?" Grace protested, her voice shaking. Helena dragged her toward a luxury boutique, her heels clicking against the pavement. The contrast between the gleaming store windows and the harsh street reality was stark. Helena turned abruptly, her face twisted in disgust. "Are you out of your mind, Grace? Those people are dangerous. If you give them money, they'll use it for drugs or alcohol." "You don't know that, Helena. That man just shared the only food he had. How can you be so heartless?" Grace shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. Their argument attracted the attention of passers-by. Grace, usually shy, felt a surge of courage. She pulled free from Helena's grasp and stepped toward the street. "They're human beings, Helena. They deserve compassion," she declared, her voice gaining strength. Helena grabbed her again, her manicured nails digging into Grace's arm. "You don't understand how the world works, dear. Those people chose this life. It's not our job to save them," Helena said coldly. "Chose? No one chooses to live on the streets. How can you be so blind?" Grace's eyes filled with tears of frustration. Determined, Grace pulled away from Helena once more and crossed the street. She reached into her purse and pulled out some bills, handing them to Luke. "Please take this. I hope it helps in some way," she said softly. Luke looked up, surprised and touched by her gesture. Their eyes met, and an unspoken connection passed between them. "Thank you, miss. Your kindness means more than you know," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "It's nothing, really." "I just wish I could do more," Grace murmured, both relieved and frustrated. Helena watched from a distance, her face a mix of anger and calculation. Her eyes narrowed as she observed Luke. There was something about him that intrigued her, something beyond his tattered appearance. Grace returned to Helena's side, bracing herself for more scolding, but Helena surprised her with a strange smile. Since you're so intent on helping people like him, Grace, maybe it's time I taught you a lesson about them, Helena said with a sinister tone. Grace felt a wave of apprehension. What are you planning? She asked, her voice filled with unease. You'll find out soon enough, Helena replied, her eyes gleaming with a cold determination as they walked away. Back at the mansion, Helena stormed through the door, her heels echoing through the marble hallway. Grace followed silently, unsettled by her stepmother's sudden change in attitude. Adam, Grace's father, emerged from his office, concern etched on his face. What's going on? He asked. Your daughter is out of control, Adam. She was giving money to beggars on the street, Helena shouted, her voice dripping with indignation. Adam looked from Helena to Grace, confused. Is this true, Grace? He asked softly. Yes, but I was just trying to help someone in need. What's wrong with that? Grace defended herself. Helena pulled Adam into his office, slamming the door behind them. She's ruining our reputation. Associating with beggars? This is unacceptable, Helena raged. Adam sighed, sinking into his chair. She has a good heart, Helena. We can't punish her for that, he said weakly. A good heart is a weakness, Adam, and I have a plan to teach her a lesson, Helena replied, her voice now calm and calculated. Adam tensed. What kind of plan? He asked cautiously. We'll force her to marry that beggar, Luke. It'll show her what happens when you get too close to people like him, Helena said with a twisted smile. Adam was horrified. You've gone too far, Helena. You can't do that to Grace, he protested. Watch me, Helena replied coldly. It's the only way she'll learn. Adam stood in stunned silence as Helena outlined her cruel plan. His heart ached for his daughter, but years of manipulation by Helena had worn down his resolve. He tried to protest again, but his words faltered under Helena's cold gaze. Helena, this will break her spirit. Grace deserves happiness, not punishment, Adam said softly, his voice filled with desperation. Happiness? In this world, Adam, happiness is a luxury we can't afford. She'll thank us later for this tough lesson, Helena replied sharply, her mind already set. Adam reluctantly nodded, knowing he had lost this battle. As Helena left the room, he remained slumped in his chair, consumed by guilt. Meanwhile, across town, Luke was sitting on a bench in a park, reflecting on the strange turn his life had taken. He thought about the kind woman, Grace, who had shown him compassion when no one else would. The memory of her generosity stirred something inside him. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just a longing to feel like a person again. His thoughts were interrupted when Helena appeared in front of him, her designer coat in impeccable. You're Luke, right? She asked, her voice dripping with disdain. Luke stood, confused but polite. Yes, ma'am, what can I do for you? I'm Helena, Grace's stepmother, she said, flashing a cold smile. I have a proposal for you, Luke. Helena wasted no time explaining her twisted plan. She offered Luke money, more than he had ever imagined, in exchange for his agreement to marry Grace. The idea of a life of comfort and security tugged at Luke, but he recoiled at the thought of deceiving someone as kind as Grace. You're asking me to marry your stepdaughter for money? I can't do that, Luke said, shaking his head in disbelief. She doesn't. Helena's eyes flashed with irritation, but she quickly changed tactics. Think about the money, Luke. With it, you could help all those people you care about on the streets. You could feed them, shelter them, give them a chance, she said, her voice smooth. Luke hesitated, torn between his moral compass and the temptation to help others. The thought of his fellow homeless friends suffering gnawed at him. Could this deal really be a way to help them? Was it worth? I don't know, Luke muttered his. Of course you do, Luke, Helena pressed, leaning in closer. This is an opportunity to change not just your life, but the lives of everyone you've ever wanted to help. All you have to do is mar. As Luke considered the offer, his eyes fell on a small brooch pinned to Helena's coat, a delicate gold design of a rose intertwined with vines. Something about it stirred a distant memory, a fragment from a past. This brooch, Luke murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. I've seen it before. Helena quickly covered the brooch with her hand. It's just a family heirloom. Nothing of importance, she said dismissively. His mind struggled to grasp the pieces of a long-buried memory. A woman, a soft voice, a child. Could it be? Come, Luke, let's discuss this further at the mansion, Helena said, sensing his hesitation and steering him toward a waiting car. Luke reluctantly followed, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and determination. As he climbed into the luxurious vehicle, his thoughts lingered on the brooch, the memory it stirred, and the weight on the back at the mansion. Grace sat by her bedroom window, her thoughts consumed with worry. She had seen Helena's cold smile earlier, and it left her feeling uneasy. When she noticed a car pull into the driveway and saw Luke stepping out, her heart raced. Why is he here? What is Helena planning? Grace murmured, fear tightening her chest. Helena, not one to waste time, immediately sought out Grace. She knocked on Grace's bedroom door, her voice falsely sweet as she called out, Grace, darling, we need to talk. Grace turned from the window, her FA. All in good time, dear, Helena replied, stepping into the room with an air of authority. First, sit down. Helena stopped pacing and turned to face Grace. You're going to marry Luke, the beggar you were so eager to help to. Oh, but I am. And before you think about refusing, let me explain what happens if you don't cooperate, Helena said, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. Grace's legs felt weak, and she sat down again, her mind reeling. I only wanted to help someone in need. What did I do so wrong? You can't force me to do this. It's illegal, immoral, she argued. Helena leaned in, her voice cold and cruel. I can, and I will, unless you want to see Luke face serious charges. It would be such a shame if the police were to find something illegal in his possession, wouldn't? Grace's heart pounded in her chest. You wouldn't dare! He's innocent. He has nothing to do with this, she stammered, fear-gripped. I would and I will, unless you agree, Helena said, straightening up with a satisfied smile. All you need to do is marry him. He'll have a comfortable life, and you'll learn a valuable lesson about the co. Meanwhile, Luke was led to a luxurious guest room where a butler provided him with clean clothes and toiletries. He stared at the marble bathtub, overwhelmed by the extravagance. How long has it been since I've had a real bath? He murmured to himself. As Luke washed away the grime of the streets, he couldn't shake the memory of the brooch, nor the unsettling feeling that Helena's proposal wasn't as simple as it seemed. He scrubbed his skin, feeling as though he were shedding years of hardship wet. Dressed in clothes that didn't feel like his own, Luke caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Is this really me? He whispered, touching his now smooth face after shaving off his beard. As Luke descended the stairs, he caught sight of Grace. She gasped when she saw him, her eyes wide with surprise. Luke, I almost didn't recognize you, she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and something else. Perhaps hope. Helena appeared, her voice cutting through the tension. Ah, Luke, you cleaned up nicely, she remarked with a false cheerfulness, her eyes glint. Luke nodded, unable to find the right words. As they moved toward the dining room, he felt Grace's gaze lingering on him, and for the first time, he wondered what she really thought of him. The next few days were a blur of preparations for the wedding, and as Grace sat in a beauty salon, watching herself being transformed into a bride, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of determination. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn. I can't change Helena's plan, but I can help Luke. I can make a difference in his life, Grace thought to herself. In the days leading up to the wedding, whispers circulated among the staff and guests about Helena's past, hinting at dark secrets Grace had never known. Determined to uncover the truth, she vowed to find out who Helena really was and why she was so obsessed with controlling their. The day of the wedding arrived, and as Grace walked down the aisle, she locked eyes with Luke, sensing that he too was struggling under the weight of the situation. But neither of them could have prepared for the shocking revelations that were about to occur. The atmosphere in the church was thick with tension as Grace walked down the aisle in her wedding dress. Her heart pounded in her chest, and though her steps were steady, her mind was racing. Each step brought her closer to Luke, and with every inch forward, her resolve grew stronger. She locked eyes with him, and for a brief moment, there was an understanding between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that both were being forced into something beyond. Luke stood at the altar, his face pale but determined. He had spent the last few days wrestling with the knowledge that this marriage wasn't just a twisted punishment for Grace. It was part of something much larger, something dark that Helena had been hiding for years. But he hadn't yet told Grace what he had discovered. He had to wait for. As Grace reached the altar, the Reverend began the ceremony. His voice echoed through the church, but it felt distant to Luke and Grace, who were both lost in their own thoughts. Luke's mind kept going back to the conversation he had had with the elderly man who had approached him a few days earlier. The man had told him things about Helena's past that sent shockwaves through Luke's soul, things that could change everything. The ceremony proceeded, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, the Reverend reached the critical moment. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak. For a brief second, everything. And then, to everyone's shock, Helena. I have something to say, she declared, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Her cold, calculating smile was on full display as she walked down the AI. Grace's heart sank as she watched her stepmother approach, the ominous feeling she had been carrying for days now coming to a head. Luke stiffened, knowing this was Helena's moment to publicly humiliate Grace. Helena stood next to the altar, facing the congregation with a theatrical air. Dear friends, she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I believe it is only fair that you all know the truth about this marriage. After all, it is quite the spectacle, isn't it? She glanced at Grace, her eyes gleaming with malice. This young woman, she continued, pointing at Grace, thought she could defy her social standing by mingling with the likes of beggars and street people. And so, here we are. She's about to marry one. Gasps of shock rippled through the church. Luke clenched his fists at his sides, trying to control the anger boiling within him. Helena's voice grew colder. Grace, in her foolish compassion, has decided to throw away everything, her family's reputation, her status, her future, to marry this man, who until last week was living on the... Grace stood frozen, her face pale with humiliation. But as Helena continued her cruel speech, something inside Grace shifted. The initial shock began to wear off, and in its place a new fire ignited, one of defiance and strength. Before Grace could react, Luke stepped forward, his voice. The church fell silent as all eyes turned to Luke. Helena, taken aback by his sudden intervention, sneered at him. What do you think you're doing? She hissed. Luke's eyes locked onto Helena's, and for the first time, there was no fear in them, only determination. I'm telling the truth you've hidden for so long, he said, his voice gaining strength. Helena's face faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. What nonsense are you talking? Luke took a deep breath, gathering his courage. My real name isn't Luke. It's David Hayes. Gasps filled the room as Luke, no, David, continued. I'm the son of your first husband, Richard Hayes. Helena's face paled as murmurs erupted from the congregation. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, her confusion mounting. What? She whispered, her eyes wide with shock. David's voice was steady as he addressed the church. Years ago, Helena, my stepmother, married my father. When he passed away under mysterious circumstances, she inherited everything. But there was one problem. Me. I was the rightful heir to my father's fortune. Grace's breath caught in her throat as the truth began to. David continued, his voice unwavering. Helena didn't want me around. I was a threat to her newly acquired wealth and status. So she abandoned me, left me on the streets as a child, far away from anyone who knew my identity. I grew up with nothing, not even the memory of who I really was. Until now. Helena's mask of composure cracked. This is absurd, she spat. Absurd, David replied, his voice growing sharper. It all makes sense now, Helena. You didn't recognize me when you saw me on the streets, but I remembered something. The brooch you wear. He pointed to the gold brooch pinned to her coat, the same one that had triggered his distant memories. It was the one thing I held on to when you left me behind. The church was dead silent. Grace felt the ground shift beneath her as the reality of the situation set in. Her stepmother, the woman who had controlled her life, was responsible for unimaginable cruelty. I've been living as a beggar, not knowing who I really was, while you lived in luxury, David said, his voice steady with conviction. You tried to erase me from your life, but now I'm standing here. Helena, now visibly shaken, tried to regain control. You're lying. This is all a lie, she shouted, but the fear in her voice was undeniable. David turned to Grace, his eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. Grace, your kindness that day on the street gave me the strength to face the truth. You were the Rhea. Grace, still reeling from the revelations, felt her heart break for him. She stepped forward, standing beside him in solidarity. Helena, you've lied and manipulated for too long, Grace said, her voice trembling but determined. I won't let you control me any. At that moment, the doors to the church burst open and several police officers entered. One of them stepped forward, holding a warrant. Helena Hayes, you are under arrest for fraud, theft, and suspicion of involvement in the death. Helena's face drained of all color. No! This can't be happening, she screamed. But the officers moved swiftly. The congregation watched in stunned silence as Helena was led away. Adam, Grace's father, stood in the back, his face pale with disbelief. His eyes met Grace's, filled with sorrow and regret. As Helena was taken out of the church, the weight of her lies and deceptions seemed to lift. The truth, finally revealed, left everyone reeling, but it also brought a sense of justice. David turned to Grace, his expression softening. I'm sorry you had to go through this, he said quietly. Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, David, I'm glad you found the truth. And I'm glad we're. They stood side by side at the altar, not as strangers forced into marriage, but as two people who had survived unimaginable trials, and who now had the chance to build a new life, free from the shadows of Helena's.